As both an ethical advisor and cultural policy expert, where do you personally draw the line when it comes to cooperating with these states that have a record of suppressing cultural rights or marginalizing minorities? Can you recall, for example, a specific case in which UNESCO succeeded through, silent diplomacy and advancing cultural rights behind the scenes, or conversely, a case where it failed and became an instrument of state propaganda?
Even to myself, I ask a question in working in Serbia in the present moment with a very authoritarian government which is dividing population. Should I still keep my place in UNESCO National Commission? And I do keep this place because I don't want to resign. I want to make them a little bit job difficult to find arguments to dismiss me. Now the minister changed who doesn't care because the role of National UNESCO Commission is not significant in every country, and in our, basically I have to say, is insignificant, so he doesn't care. The previous minister tried to find arguments to dismiss me immediately just because of my free speech. But it's coming from the country who used to be under UN embargo in between 92-95 and in between 98 and 2000. I completely understood at that time economic, political embargo. What I didn't understand, and I will never understand, is educational, cultural embargo. So I'm always against cultural and educational embargo because it prevents the young people and those that are most useful in spreading different values of peace, values of human life, etc., among population, to be heard, to have a voice, and so on. But for UNESCO, it's a really difficult task to decide when and how to join this kind of embargoes. And I remember about us experts, our colleague from Germany, UNESCO expert, we are a group of technical experts for the convention 2005, sent us a letter when the very day the war in Ukraine started, that we have to condemn the Russian aggression, etc., etc. And some of us Europeans responded immediately. Yes, we have to make a statement as UNESCO expert. We haven't even spoken about like UNESCO as an institution. We knew that, but as a group of UNESCO experts. Till one of our colleagues from Africa, Yari Kamara, has sent us a letter. Oh, I would be just curious to know, have we made such a letter when war in Sudan started, when war in Yemen started, etc., etc., etc.? And that was the very moment that we realized Europe-centeredness of all of us, basically, and that when something is happening there, we take it more seriously. Still today, we have war in Gaza, in Palestine, that is severely dividing European, I would say, realm. Because on one side you have governments that supports Israel by traffic arms and by all possible means, and you have civil society and organization, they mostly support the victim, the Gaza. But some European countries are introduced severe censorship on information about Gaza, and UNESCO is not yet clear about it. As I said, I usually work in authoritarian or semi-authoritarian countries such as Cambodia. We went, me and my colleague from Vesna Čopić, to help Cambodian Ministry of Culture in 2013 to develop creative industries. The very moment, 2005 convention support, at that very moment, when we came and we make our research, it was clear that it's out of the question to speak about creative industries because it's a country which do not obey copyright. There is no system to collect copyrights and so on. There is no creative industries and there is no popular. The 80% population is still rural. There is not enough city population, middle class city population, who is everywhere in the world, the one who is, how would say, audience, client, buyer of creative industry product, would it be book or a ticket in theater or ticket in cinema and so on. It was two separate worlds. And what we have achieved, we didn't achieve anything related to creative industries, but we achieved that after, not immediately, after 2 years, that arts forum and council was organized, that the ministry sit together with civil society and artists and so on. And you know what several of the artists told me? But several in different, let's say, corner of this big room when I approach each of them to congratulate them that they came to the ministry. They were all well dressed and say, we are so proud. But first of all, because our parents, hearing that we are invited in the government, in the Ministry of Culture, said, oh, but it seems that what you are doing somehow is important because their work didn't have any social value because they were not recognized as entities. So I think it's worthwhile to work in authoritarian countries because slowly, it's not easy, you start changing things and how to say, giving more, opening such topics that were not that they were been forbidden, they were just out of the scope. So yes, we are needed there because sometimes it's not only about fighting political ideology, which might be populist, chauvinist, and so on. It's really opening up the eyes of the state apparatus, what can be done for the benefit of the society.
That's a very fascinating example that you mentioned of how intervention from UNESCO actually opened up space for protecting the rights of cultural activists, artists. And I think you made a very important and crucial point also in how the the fallacies of authoritarian regimes versus democracies, where the dilemma, the ethical dilemma, sometimes is more with regards to the so-called democracies failing to take any action to prevent the loss of the hundreds of thousands of lives. For example, in the case of Gaza, as you mentioned, and European democracies were too hesitant to prevent arming the entity that was taking the lives of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. But we seldom ask the ethical dilemma of whether we should or whether UNESCO should work with them or not, or the UNESCO as an international entity itself did not have the imperative to take more action in its capacity to save more lives in Palestine. Yet the emancipatory power of culture as a driver of social justice and collective imagination is often lost, I would say, in the bureaucratic procedures or political compromises. So, considering all these structural challenges that we have discussed, what is one tangible example or one tangible or actionable step that you think UNESCO could take today effectively in order to promote cultural rights as human rights? In other words, how can it recover the original vision of culture as a process of emancipation rather than, just a tool of soft power. Does UNESCO have that capacity, or if it does, what are the actionable steps that it can take in order to achieve that?
I would unfortunately say that UNESCO has a limited capacity, as United Nations have also. We see that the fact that in United Nations there are superpower who have a veto, this is something, for example, that should be absolutely dismantled by United Nations themselves. Why someone being superpower once upon a time should have a right for a veto? What makes this country so privileged to have this kind of right to decide about others and so on? Due to many bureaucratic elements, UNESCO is difficult to achieve consensus among countries, and now there is always different geopolitical regroupings and so on. But even if they would be achieving consensus, that wouldn't be to benefit. No, there was no time when embargo really achieved, political change. No. It was different things that finally led toward fall of apartheid regime and so on. That has to be also studied why and how. It's not a good measure, but what UNESCO can do, that was your question, they can introduce some new value criteria, exactly like this. How many languages are spoken on the territory of your country, and for how many languages you have guaranteed primary education and publishing houses in those languages, which has to be supported by public money. There is no other way. That's the moment when Roma population throughout, I'm sorry for many examples from EU and Europe, but I think if there are a lot of problems and inequalities in Europe, which is the richest part of the world, how we can accuse some really poor government for not, in poor area of the world, for not having standards of human rights protection that needs a lot of investment and leads infrastructural investment, for example, schools and so on. So that's the reason I use example of Roma and nation-state representation in international systems is just continuation of not the best tradition at all. Some people, like Uyghurs or Kurds, or not to speak about numerous African nations, are never represented as such because they live spread, or Roma, they are spread in different countries and they are never represented in this country. But these kind of symbolical gestures, for example, this help of UNESCO to Roma community is symbolical gestures, but it's giving a certain right because they are usually seen as social problem. Now it's even new type of Roma activist is using another level of xenophobia in Europe, saying why you are inviting workers from Bangladesh, Nepal, and so on, why you don't invite your own Roma community who is 90% non-employed. And then everyone looks at each other like no one thought about it. Like we don't have a labor force, we have to import labor force. But we have a lot of unemployed labor force under the radar. And I think that's the role of UNESCO also to really underline the communities or minority groups whose human rights are really endangered sexual minorities, gender, etc. And we can see that they do something, but, for example, a fund for supporting creative diversity is this year, last competition, supported half projects has been linked to creative industries, professionalization of the sector, and so on, and the other half to empowering of women. But there are also other groups that should be empowered, and I see those instruments of UNESCO has to be more diversified, although they are also heavily dependent on donors. As the major donor now is European Union, they want to give money for creative industries.
I would like to tap on 2 points that you made in your conversation and the response that was very insightful. One that talking about the vetoing power, which is very contradictory to the spirit of United Nations. We're having an organization called United Nations because the purpose was to give everyone an equal space for all the nations to be actors on the international arena. The second, talking about sanctions or embargoes on education making no sense and being very a big challenge and a big obstacle to promoting cultural diversity and again giving civil societies, academics, artists equal opportunity. I think Iranian scholars, academics, and artists have felt that very deeply because this is very common. Iranian scholars have been rejected publishing in international journals, for example. There have been limitations accessing international, journals or scientific societies. I would like to ask you, how do you think independent scholars, artists, and independent cultural actors can help hold the organization accountable for this mission?
I think that's a crucial question. I see bigger and bigger role in civil society developing actions which might be even called citizens diplomacy, which relates to international, not only cultural, but also political relations and so on. And especially when it comes to association of independent actors throughout the world, where they can, or from some country which they see needs and potentials, sometimes better, sometimes in accordance with their country, because then and I will take one example. Heritage Without Borders, it was at the beginning a Swedish organization, and they succeeded to come with the Swedish money of developmental Swedish agency to the Balkans. And what they did both. They, on one side, helped raising a network in between independent organizations that promote cultural heritage, tangible and intangible, etc. And this was called Southeast European Heritage Network, which is operational and so on. And on the other side, they were first to connect museums of the region, and that was called Balkan Museum Network. It's very interesting that those who are public institutions, they opted for the name Balkan, which is never used in official we are now Western Balkan, but not Balkan. And we usually, as scholars, we refused this title Western Balkan because it doesn't reflect any reality. Because we were never felt, for example, Serbia is much more closer to Bulgaria, but Bulgaria is the Balkan, Eastern or Central Balkan, but not the Western Balkan. Then toward Albania, which historically we didn't have any contact. What I wanted to say is that professional associations of writers, of artists, cinematographers, and so on, They are already relatively influential, but they could be much more influential on the world scale. Exactly on one side, preventing states or public institutions, etc., to revenge just by ignoring colleagues from countries that are not seen as free country, that are probably totalitarian, probably authoritarian, maybe even aggressive, but scholars are not, or artists are not the guilty ones. And for more social justice and justice in the world, I think that the professional sectors should have more power, more insight, and to let their voice to be heard and things to be done. Because if we leave everything to states, then it comes high level of political negotiation, economical negotiation, etc. And more or less, we are going to end up in different form of neocolonialism, which is going to be today's common joy in Serbia, that we have invisible colonizer. These are Emirates who are owning our agricultural land, who are owning the most important investment. And the news from yesterday, they are the most probable buyer of the Russian part of the petrol industry in Serbia, so that we can avoid embargo, economic embargo against Russia, because the Russian owner is under embargo, and so on. But it's all states are. Governments are looking only very lucratively and on a short term. I am now, this 4 year, in the government, but professional associations, would it be economical, scientific, and so on, they have much larger and longer perspectives and can suggest much better decisions for a better future of the world, not only in one country per se.